Hello, everyone. My name's Paul. I am the education lead for the Ministry of Eco Education, and we're the charity supporting teachers to weave sustainability through their teaching. Welcome to what is now the fifth in our summer series of online panel discussions, exploring some of the big questions in education. Now, at the Ministry of Eco Education, we bring together resources, opportunities, and inspiration from hundreds and hundreds of different organisations into national curriculum aligned learning journeys that are framed by big questions. And I've dug in and found some big questions that I thought relate to what we're going to be talking about in a minute. So we've got one learning journey that explores who's in charge, another that is the future already written, and then there's even one that says how important is play. So then maybe that gives you a flavour of some of the kind of things that we explore with the big questions. Now, it's wonderful to be hosting this discussion just days after Grounded, where educators came together to practice a regenerative education system. And I know Meryl's on the call, and well done, Meryl, for everything you've done over the last few days. I thought you might have been asleep, not on this call. Yeah, and thank you everyone who came to Northumberland. So today we're exploring the big question: can schools be hubs for imagining the future? And we're joined by four wonderful panelists. We've got Deborah, Megan, Gemma, and Eliska. Now, we're going to start in a moment with each of the panelists sharing their response to the question, and then we're going to open it up to wider discussion with questions from the audience. Um, Now, please add your thoughts in the chat throughout the event. Yeah, do feel free to kind of add any thoughts and comments into the chat. Um, so, just to give some context, then, Rob Hopkins is obviously the inspiration for this, or one of, and it's books like From What Is to What If, and more recently, Falling in Love with the Future, that have inspired this thinking. And what Rob is trying to do there is suggest that there is an infinite number of possible futures that lie ahead of us. Like he thinks of them like threads stretching out into the distance. Now, Rob originally was the co-founder of the International Network of Transition Towns, Cities, and the transition movement. Um, but what he does is he invites us to travel to future worlds that we would actually want to live in. And he asks us to consider what would the world look like if we all got to work imagining and then building a world we were deeply in love with. Now, we also have people like Phoebe Tickle. She's another inspiration for this, and she has an organization called Moral Imaginations. And they describe their aim to grow the moral imagination through collective learning to increase radical kinship with human and more than human worlds, both present, past, and future. Now, for decades, the environmental movement has had many shortcomings, and things like communicating messages that are often really doom focused and telling people what they can't do has been a big focus. And there's this analogy where it's easier, maybe, to sell the brownie than it is to sell the recipe. Maybe we need to communicate a lush green and verdant vision that everyone can buy into. Now, too often schools have been described as exam factories where creativity and imagination are stamped on in the pursuit of exam success. And for example, teacher recruitment for subjects like art and design and music have seen some dramatic decline in the number of people deciding to become those teachers. Now, many schools report a difficulty and challenges in offering creative courses and subjects because of a lack of being able to find the appropriate staff. And actually, the number of students taking creative subjects at GCSE and A level has declined for a number of years. Now, another thing to note is it AI? Is AI leading us to the death of the imagination? Is our capacity to wonder, invent, and conjure original images stifled by algorithm-driven media and maybe a societal over-reliance on instant answers and automated tools? So, what then about schools? Do schools have the power to change society? Can they mobilize our collective imagination? And to help us answer these questions, I'd first like to introduce Deborah Curtis. And Deborah is creative director at The Great Imagining. And The Great Imagining invites us, or it is an invitation, sorry, and a platform to imagine and take action towards a greener, fairer, wiser future. And among lots and lots of things, they run workshops and assemblies in schools. and they create particularly their own festivals, and that's something I've seen some really inspiring action out of. They've done gatherings, talks, and conferences, and they are all about collaborative, accessible learning adventures for young people and their communities. So, Deborah, I'd like to welcome you to the panel.
Take my mic off. Does that work? Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds great.
cool. Um, Thank you for inviting me onto this really brilliant panel, which is just so close to my heart. So a little bit more context for me, although you did quite a good introduction there. I've nearly 30 years experience of devising and producing learning adventures for children and young people across the UK in partnership with museums, galleries, land trusts and businesses, as well as of course schools, universities and in every region seemingly. Over the last 18 years, having founded our young person's arts and education charity, the House of Fairy Tales, we've worked with hundreds of artists, artists and designers through large festivals, as well as smaller, more theatrical events, and exhibitions and publications, such as newspapers. Since November 2018, when I gave a talk on education at a youth climate conference in Amsterdam, which shifted my personal understanding of the timescale as well as the scale of the climate crisis profoundly, we've pivoted to climate, ecology, social justice and futures literacy related content. This was around the time that Greta Thunberg was setting up Fridays for the Future, as well as Extinction Rebellion, who was starting out with their awareness raising campaign, as well as the publishing of the landmark Autumn 2018 IPCC report. This futures work is called The Great Imagining, as a reference to the Great Exhibition of 1852. Only instead of being in one centralised crystal palace, run by the monarchy and government as a celebration of the Industrial Revolution, colonialism and imperialism, which arguably got us into this trouble in the first place, the Great Imagining is a platform and an invitation, as Paul said, to imagine and take action towards a greener, fairer, wiser future. We've been action researching this idea over the 7 years since then, and for the last 3 years have been turning schools and their communities across Staffordshire and the West Midlands into temporary centres of future imagining, underpinned by the literacies needed, such as carbon literacy, materials literacy and nature literacy, as well as soft skills and capacities such as empathy, oracy, collaboration and teamwork, as well as, of course, the nature connections and the awe and wonder of life itself and our vast universe that are needed to support this imagining in the first place. Since November, we're going bigger and bolder as a response to the National Emergency Briefing, which is touring the country as the Public Emergency Briefing, in film screenings from cathedrals to community centres. For those who aren't aware of this event, 1,200 people, including 200 MPs, were briefed about the level of emergency we're in by a panel of experts from every sector, from food security to economics and defence. Hosted by Chris Packham and Mike Berners-Lee, these briefings have been made into a Gogglebox type film, with celebrities such as Deborah Meaden and Jennifer Saunders, as well as members of the wider public. These viewings are also being followed by discussions about how communities might respond. Around the same time as this national emergency briefing, the brilliant historian and author Rutger Bregman gave the Wreath Lectures on Radio 4 around the topic of his new book, Bold Ambition, with these ideas now travelling through communities across the UK and America, as well as Europe. His proposition invites us all to be braver and bolder at a time of great jeopardy, when the living ecosystem of our planet, as well as humans everywhere who are suffering, need us to come together to make the probable into the possible. So we've been slowly and carefully growing and cultivating relationships with a wide network of creatives, experts and people with lived experience across every sector and region of the UK and beyond. We're now planning our wider campaign, which will be launched in the spring through different sectors, from education, health and sport, as well as less obvious parts of our social infrastructure, such as law, economics, criminal justice, energy and power, defence and local government, as well as in partnership with regional hubs across the UK. This process will be delivered through the rhythm of the seasons. So in spring, nature puts on her magnificent blossoming show to attract the pollinators, who fertilise the seeds which are planted into the soil to grow the next season's crop. In this cultural metaphor, who's putting out the blossom? Who are the pollinators? What are the seeds? And which soil are these being planted into? Then this crop is celebrated and shared regionally and through every sector in the summer harvesting, And then the breast of this crop will go into the preserving and propagating season in the autumn to be mushroomed back out into the grassroots with the help of influencers and celebrities. So over the winter, we will evaluate what worked and what didn't work so well and grow new partnerships and ideas to go back out there in the spring to start again with the annual rhythm of the seasons. This wider movement will, with a fair wind and enough rich probiotic in the cultural soil, act as a mycelium network of future possibilities, sharing and platforming case studies, thought experiments and creative pathways, such as artworks, through every region and sector, and then cross-fertilising and propagating as a festival of the good stuff. Schools as well as colleges and universities are of course vital hubs at the centre of every community, so we're excited about what this national initiative can inspire and stimulate in the rich soil of the education sector. Students are not currently being encouraged and gifted enough with the values, life purpose, citizenship, skills and capacities needed for the future that they're growing into, and this wider national programme will support schools to do this work in playful, creative, collaborative projects that will feel purpose-driven, rewarding and fun. Thank you.
Thank you. There's some really interesting references there. I think it was interesting though that you started referring back to events of history that can inspire, and we can rewrite those and use those as inspiration. And then yeah, you talked a fair bit about the sort of importance of modeling practice and having opportunities to share the things people are doing. And at the end, they're referencing the shortcomings of the current system. So it'd be interesting to dig into those in a minute. Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm going to now pass over to Megan. And Megan. Megan Murray Pepper is an English teacher, sustainability educator, and campaigner with decades of experience in secondary English schools. And Megan, you now support teacher training across a variety of institutions, including the Centre for Climate and Sustainability Education at UCL, and then also at the University of Oxford. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Yeah, I'm going to talk particularly from the point of view of the work that I've been doing with UCL's Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education. So probably it will be familiar to most of you, but the centre, the CCCSE, very catchy, is kind of a hub at UCL for doing policy research and teacher professional development around climate, nature and sustainability education, even though nature didn't make it into the title. And I'm glad that nature literacy has come up already, because it seems to be sometimes the slightly forgotten bit of that that whole label. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit more from the perspective of how this imagining and how this kind of future literacy can be actually happening within the space of the curriculum. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion afterwards about kind of how the sort of inside schools and outside schools can start to kind of connect up, perhaps in that mycelial way that you mentioned, Deborah. So yeah, I'm thinking particularly from the point of view of how the real importance of having climate, nature and sustainability being futures focused and having that futures focused education happening across all subjects of the curriculum. So the sort of status quo is that that content typically exists within science and geography. Again, this will be familiar to many of you. And the curriculum area review has suggested intensifying the focus within science, geography, and a couple of other subjects like DT and citizenship. But what underpins the whole UCL teacher development programme is the conviction that that education has to be cross-curricular. So I'm looking particularly at the importance of arts-based approaches, because of course these are the subjects where they're absolutely founded on vision, imagination, empathy, creativity, and all of those qualities that we really need to be cultivating. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about what I perceive as the significance of English and drama in particular as cultivating sort of skills to imagine the future. So, English, I'll start sort of with English and thinking about how that is such a key place within schools to be supporting students to kind of conceptualise, articulate and express the features that they want to see, both orally, in writing, in kind of multimedia forms. But that's the place where we can really kind of cultivate different forms of expression, cultivate rhetorical confidence. And it's also a place, it's really significant for me. It's a place where we can really think about questions of genre. So in terms of kind of narratives, shared cultural narratives about what the future is, we're so familiar with the world as it is. It's very hard to see often beyond the world that exists, the narrative of the status quo. But we're also really familiar with story shapes like apocalypse and dystopia, and they get to dominate and take up a lot of space in the collective cultural imagination. They're really familiar. We know what they look like. We're less familiar with kind of messy, provisional, but much more likely kind of scenarios. So I see English as a place where we really need to be kind of critiquing and examining genres of cultural narrative. And, there's all sorts of interesting possibilities being advocated. Alternative story forms like Throughtopia is one label, or Positopia. So actually inviting students to identify, to play with, to experiment with genres of story that give us futures, that shape futures collectively in our kind of social world, in our cultural world, and to actually work with them themselves. And I really think that the English classroom is the place you can be doing this in all sorts of kind of multimedia forms. And that might include, for example, adaptation and updating of kind of classic and familiar stories and transposing them to a future. And that also helps students to understand that stories are not fixed. They are things that can be rewritten, and they can be kind of reformed and reshaped and kind of taken ownership of as well. And I guess a further point that I think is really significant about English is it is also the place I think we must start developing the tools to deal with dis and misinformation. So kind of, that critical literacy and media literacy, because again, I think messages about what the future is going to be are very stark and they're out there in the culture, and particularly the media that we encounter, but actually helping students have the tools to sort of deconstruct what they're being offered as a future, and again enable them to hopefully express alternative kind of imaginaries. So that's just a little bit about what I see as the role of English in particular to offer that. And then I just also want to talk a little bit about drama. So I've been developing both modules for English teachers and modules for drama teachers, and I'll put the link in the chat in a couple of minutes. I can't talk and post things at the same time. I just have not been able to develop that functionality. So in drama, just a couple of things to start with. Drama is obviously in itself a curriculum subject, or not always, but hopefully a curriculum subject that has some very specific qualities. But also I wanted to throw in the idea of drama as a methodology that can also be used across the curriculum. And that's one of the things that's wonderful about drama. It's a set of tools and a set of methods that can be used across the curriculum. And any time that students spend kind of creating drama or occupying drama process, I think is time that they are spending steeped in the provisional and steeped in the participatory and steeped in a kind of maybe and a kind of what if mode. That is what drama does really effectively. And again, that's something that students don't get enough time in, those modes of being like, oh, maybe this could be a reality. Maybe I could occupy this position. So drama can do that in lots of different ways. But when it comes to thinking about the sort of drama classroom itself and the drama curriculum itself, I just wanted to talk about an example from the module that I've been creating, and that is focusing on the idea of time travel. So connecting it to the work of Rob Hopkins, who's obviously kind of inspired this discussion. Paul has talked about Rob as this someone who works on community change and imagination activism and being able to kind of activate the power of time travel. And I've proposed that actually one thing that could happen really effectively in the drama curriculum is to orient around the idea of time travel. So Rob's work was one inspiration for that, talking about how classrooms can be places with their own time machines in which students can be projected into the future. And Rob's really good at talking about how this can be a really immersive and theatrical experience. And, classrooms are ideal places for this, where there's already a shared kind of construct. There's shared kind of rituals and shared rules, and being able to kind of orient that around the idea of time travel and entering a different kind of future. He has some specific really interesting examples in education, like having time machine clocks in history classrooms. He also talks about how there's a school in British Columbia that took the idea of 2040 as their curriculum for the year. So actually so much of the learning that they did was oriented around what is it going to look like here in 2040? And then they kind of did this enormous community showcase. So there's great kind of ideas and inspiration in Rob's work that I suggested could work particularly well for drama teachers, especially where There is a lot of opportunity in drama for devising. So, a practice where actually students are constructing and coming up with their own sort of meaningful pieces from particular stimuli. And I think time travel could be one of those. The second sort of inspiration for this was the work of, you see that, the work of Roman Krasnarich, who again, is a popular philosopher who really is focused on the idea of integrating long-term thinking into society. So, for example, in the concept of the good ancestor, which is that book. And Roman writes really effectively about, for example, the use of citizens' assemblies as obviously a tool that encourages people to participate in decision making about the future. And again, this is something I've suggested could be a real inspiration for the drama classroom as well as for classrooms more widely. This bleeds into citizenship, into PSHE. And indeed, I've run a citizens' assembly in a PSHE classroom before. But, Roman, for example, gives he cites the future design movement in Japan, where a group of citizens invited to take part in such an assembly. Half of them are asked to role play citizens of the future. And if they put on these ceremonial robes and they become a citizen of 2060, they are much more likely, they consistently advocate for much more transformative plans and policy. So again, that was the inspiration for thinking about how in classrooms, this idea of time travel and this idea of occupying roles, future roles, which really makes a lot of sense given our students are already positioned as future citizens, right? They don't yet have voting rights and so on. They're always thinking of themselves as sort of, in some ways, latent citizens who don't yet have kind of political say. But that kind of occupying roles of citizens of the future, unleashing the imagination, enabling people to think more radically. They were the sort of twin inspirations for encouraging drama teachers to think about how they could orient their devising work in particular around that kind of theme and unleash students' ability to kind of step into a future imaginary. So yeah, effectively those modules are a kind of way of saying, imagine a curriculum that could incorporate this kind of focus, this kind of work. All these big questions about what would we keep, what would we change, how can we see beyond the narratives that we are being kind of consistently given, many of which are quite sort of impoverished narratives, and how can we actually start to imagine futures that are more just and so on. So the kind of message to teachers within this program is to really encourage them to think of themselves as curriculum makers. So there's so much constraint. Paul's touched on that already. And I think there's a big issue around, there is so much possibility for kind of the radical imagination in the classroom. We first have to consider that teachers must be given supportive space to unleash their own imagination. Like for teachers, even to imagine these things happening in their classroom is the first step. And there's a lot of barriers to that. But I think that's another piece of the puzzle, which is making sure that teachers get the kind of support and the space to start imagining, to start dreaming, and that is much more likely to translate into them feeling that agency as curriculum makers that could potentially put this into practice in their classrooms. So I'll stop there for now, but
Well, thank you so much, Megan. There's so much in what you've just said there, and what I really appreciate is there's so many tangible elements to that, particularly from your experience around the English and drama curriculum. I really like those the ideas of challenging the narratives, particularly around the status quo. I think, as much as we're talking about school students being latent citizens, there's also this very fixed idea that teachers are talking to young people about what job or what role they're going to go into, and there's this very fixed idea of what society will look like and should look like, and how young people should fit into that. And maybe that's something we can explore a bit more in a moment as well. And I think you also kind of loosely referenced there. Um, the idea that actually societal change comes around the stories that we tell, and you didn't necessarily say it, but I was the inference that I got was that, often traditionally this has been around scientific or technological solutions, and that maybe something we can explore in a moment is the idea that the solutions won't necessarily come from scientists or tech bros. Um, Okay, thank you so much, Megan. I'm gonna invite now Gemma Connell. Now, Gemma is director of youth programs at Another Way, and Another Way is on a mission to empower people to live with kindness towards our planet, and they have a vision of a world in which society lives regeneratively. So, Gemma, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's if we planned a great set profusely at everything Megan was saying there. And it's also very much because my background um, is actually in the performing arts. This is an interesting one to kind of note, kind of talking about, as well as Paul alluded to just there, that these solutions might not come from the scientists, they might come from the artists as well. There's always a funny moment where people hear what I do for a living and ask me where I got my PhD in environmental science when it's actually in dance. So I'm gonna echo a few of the things that Megan has here. But to Another Way. So I am Director of Youth Programs at Another Way, leading the Power of 10 teams. The Power of 10 is the name of our youth programs. And schools have very much been our key audience for a number of years now. So we were set up about 7 years ago by Amy Bray, who I'm sure many of you will know, and she set up the charity when she was just 16 years old. And now at the ripe old age of 23, she is leading us into a whole new chapter. And the very youth-led element of Another Way continues to be at the heart of what we do. So that's the kind of angle that I'm going to come at this is the very, very youth-led angle. And imagining the future with young people in schools has been at the heart of what we do for a very long time now. Um, and I think my background as someone who's come from the creative industries, from the performing arts, has fit very, very nicely into the direction that Another Way is heading in when it comes to imagining them to work on in recent years is the gamification of climate education, and really, really highlighting elements of play and imagination in that. So for us, in change.
Gemma, sorry, can I stop you for a moment?
Yeah.
Your internet connection is relatively not stable. Would it be possible just to come off video? And I think the audio will probably come through clearer if that's all right. Sorry.
Here we go. 1 second. How's that? Can people
Yeah,
hear me?
that sounds great. Yeah, sorry. Do you want to just
Okay.
go maybe back kind of a couple of sentences? Sorry to interrupt you, but
That- That's all good. Apologies, I didn't realize. So, in short, yes, we absolutely believe Another Way that schools can be hubs for imagining the future. But we do need to think outside of systems to achieve transformational change. So, something we've been thinking about in detail is how we can support young people's imagination to make that lasting change. Imagination cannot succeed alone. And the key for us is in helping young people discover where that imagination can become a reality. In this way, we must support young people to build their transferable skills and give them opportunities to practice these in real world situations that hope to change the world for the better. So, how does this work? Well, firstly, we can work within school settings to give young people the freedom and permission to think outside of the box. It can be difficult to imagine a system different to the one that you're in, both literally and culturally. So, in a world where, of course, we know teachers have so much to think about, so much to provide to the young people that they're working with, so many targets to achieve. And where there may well be a perception from the young people that the teachers hold the power in the classroom, or I've certainly worked with a lot of young people over the past few years where they have been very, very concerned about, please tell me what the right answer is, because they want to get that right in the exam. When we're thinking about imagining the future, there isn't necessarily a right answer. So we need to kind of work on how we address that. And we have found that play and gamification have really, really helped young people in this area, giving them the opportunity to design real world solutions that directly help their schools' eco missions. And this allows us to move beyond the idea of classroom learning and show young people where they have the agency to make a real difference in the world. And with that, skills building is really key in facilitating young people to make their imagination for the future become a reality. Many of the skills that Megan has alluded to there, creativity, problem solving, mindfulness, and empathy, skills that I would argue are all green skills, are really vital for the future of our planet, but also for the future careers of the young people that we work with. And finally, practice is really, really key in this. Imagination is all about finding the solution to something, and the path to that solution may not be a straight line. It's often a very, very squiggly line. Practicing these skills within real world situations helps young people to understand how we can each reimagine our futures and the power that we hold there. So to now just give a little bit of an example of how Another Way does this, we help students design projects starting with their vision. So focusing very much on that youth-led approach that we take. Their projects can come in all shapes and sizes, from eco clubs to managing their own allotments to national climate campaigns. We encourage different mediums and try to move away from constraints, celebrating where their skills and passions can help them to take environmental action. A young person whose skills lie outside of STEM can still make a huge difference in the world. Perhaps their passion for the arts, as Megan has said, can play a role in storytelling and raising awareness around where we can protect our planet. Everyone's skills and everyone's version of imagination plays a role in tackling the climate crisis. And I personally feel that making that point is really key, given that we have worked with lots of young people who have previously felt that the only thing they can do as an individual young person to protect the environment is to recycle plastic. And of course, we know there is so much more that we can do as individuals. One of the ways that we do this at Another Way is through our new Tides of Change program, where young people experience an initial workshop from us themed around something that they would like to work on. So whether that's tackling fast fashion, helping wildlife in their local area, or how we talk about climate change in positive ways. Following this workshop, they are set a challenge. It might be to run a conversation with the senior leadership team of their school about how their school can make positive change, or to organise a clothes swap among their peers to champion the idea that we can give clothes a new life. We support these young people to make their projects happen, give them feedback along the way, and then celebrate their final achievements with an award. The other element of all of this is that at Another Way, we emphasize the importance of being motivated by joy and excitement, not fear. Our research tells us that 60% of young people have experienced eco-anxiety. So supporting young people to take action should not feed into that, in our opinion, and instead comes from a place which loves the environment and wants it to thrive, as well as celebrating all of the skills that they bring to the table. And as I mentioned, we have had really great success of late with our gamification of climate education through our Escape the Climate Crisis escape room, our new Green Careers board game, and more. Gamifying elements of our work allows the focus to remain on play whilst creatively problem solving some of those real world solutions. It's that element of play which helps imagination become a reality. We need to give young people the permission to think differently and to make mistakes in order for them to lead the way to a greener, better future. Thank you very much. I hope you all heard that. I apologize for my internet connection. These things,
Gemma, that
yeah,
was perfect.
you want them to.
The audio came through great, and thank you so much for that. Um, Gemma, just there when you were particularly towards the end there, I was thinking, gosh, it feels almost like Another Way is an organisation from the future in terms of the way that you organise yourselves and your approach, and a lot of what you were describing there, kind of modelling, yeah, the way things can be against a sort of a status quo. The other theme that chimed with me there, and I think it was similar with some of the things Megan was saying for teachers, is that sense of giving people the freedom and permission, like giving the space and holding that space for this to happen, and then yeah, that play element. I know Deborah, there's a lot of play in the events that Deborah organises, so hopefully we can talk more about play and the importance of play in a moment. So just to our final speaker then, I'd like to invite Eliska Goosh. And Eliska is the DFE's Youth Sustainability Champion. And the role is about representing young people's voices across England on climate education and sustainability. And I know, Eliska, you recently graduated from the University of Birmingham with an environmental science degree. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm also currently doing my Master of Research in Environmental Science at the University of Nottingham. So it's been a very busy year so far, especially with the Sustainability Champion role, but it's been just truly fantastic. So when I was looking at the question, I was thinking a lot about what points of views I can bring, especially from someone. The sustainability champion role, it's such a unique position. It's a fantastic role and it should be 100% expanded. And in the role, it's really crucial for us to be doing school visits. So engaging with young people, youth organizations across the whole country to then feed back these young people's ideas and challenges and what they want their future to look like, especially their climate education, to ministers and civil servants to make sure that national education represents what young people need and deserve. So I've sort of narrowed it down to three key points. So the first one is that I really see schools as like mini societal ecosystems, where I think that most educational systems still assume that the future is something that students will enter later in life, maybe when they turn 16 or 18 or go to university or get a full-time job. But I really think this pushing the future further into the future as such, it really limits imagination, and it really reduces it to readiness rather than combining creation and imagination for what the future can hold. Whereas combining the preparation and the imagination with young people can just grow up with such a clearer view and experience of what the world is and how it functions. And this could be through incorporating young people in decision making, such as student-led governments, such as the student councils, and young people contributing to their schools' climate action plans. That's such a phenomenal way to incorporate young people's voices, and not just in their schools, but young people contributing to local towns and their cities' climate action plans as well. Young people are the face of the future. They should be encouraged and empowered and have a space made for them to do so. Another way would also be sort of different ways of defining success of young people and their roles and success in the education system, where I would really like to see less pressure being put on innovation in terms of tackling the climate crisis, but also really focusing on stewardship. Everyone needs to be a steward. I think we all have a moral responsibility to be caring for this wonderful planet of ours. And I think that's really key in terms of imagining our future. We have all these problems to solve, but we also need to be protecting and maintaining and really caring for all the fantastic ecosystems and all of the wonderful systems that we have in this world already. So Megan sort of, well, highlighted the ways that education needs to challenge current assumptions and the status quo. I thought that's fantastic. So I was just going to add a little bit more to that I think a lot of talk around future skills tends to be focused on the idea of creating a new workforce, a future workforce, or tech adaptation as such. I think a far more powerful version of what skills talk and future education could be framed as and taught to students as is through spotting the hidden assumptions and steering away from the status quo and challenging the normal in young people's education and their growth and how they view jobs and progress and stability in this planet. Um, Especially in climate education. As an environmental scientist myself, we were often taught about the impacts of non-native species in certain ecosystems, but there was no sort of room created to challenge why the non-native species existed in an ecosystem in the first place. And if you do the deep dive yourself, there's a very strong link to, colonial histories, and everything is very much interdisciplinary and intersectional, and we cannot have climate education in such clear silos. And science is so separated from the arts and history and social justice as well. It's going to be very difficult to create and imagine a future when everything's so separate and segregated. Um, I think as well, young people and climate education in schools needs to be looking and understanding not only current conflicts, but imagining multiple different conflicts that might happen in the future, and even the uncomfortable and undesirable ones. And that's not to cause eco-anxiety or bring people down or get really scared about what the future could look like, but it's figuring out and designing responses to uncertainty rather than just expecting a future of certainty of we are doomed, this is what's going to happen. There are so many different paths that could happen, that we could take. And by understanding the uncertainty and teaching the action around the uncertainty, we can really focus on freezing responses and reducing eco-anxiety. And I think there's a real key gap here of building intellectual resistance to single story futures. The last key point that I wanted to focus on was that schools should be sort of a reality of interaction spaces where students and at schools can sort of act as what the world kind of acts at as, but not just studying how the world works, but really sort of engaging in what's happening in the world. I think there's a huge disconnect between what's sort of read in a textbook in the classroom versus what happens outside of the classroom. Students learn about like systems of climate and cities and economics, but rarely get the opportunity to affect them as well, understanding how those systems works, understanding the friction of them, and really help with young people being able to imagine and understand how it works and imagine what role they can play in it and imagine what their future could look like. So this could be identifying different systems in their local environment, working closely with communities and reflecting on consequences of different actions that are made, not just by like young people, but all sorts of different organizations in real time. If like a nuclear facility is built down the road from them, sort of them monitoring and seeing what that does to their community. And then the last thing I was really thinking about, I was thinking about this question was that I'd like to expand the definition of schools to educational institutions, because I think that when having a supportive and building a really emotional, resilient and explorative climate education, rather than something that's just essentially delivered, there's such a great influence, not just on the students, but the teachers and the educators and the parents and the families and the guardians and the wider community of those young people who attend these educational institutions. But also, not just young people, universities here have a significant influence, and mature students attend, and everyone of every age is sort of involved in some way or through a community or by an extension of someone. So where students are sort of encouraged to have hope of imagining a livable future, that hope can really ripple out. And that's the message I wanted to end on today.
Thank you so much, Liska. You were making me think there about we had a discussion last week which was sort of really going fundamentally into the roots of what is the purpose of education and what does success look like? And you were mentioning there this idea of a fixation on producing a future workforce, and that sort of led us down this route of people taking very scientific focused degrees that are all about, is there a job at the end of it, and kind of, if it doesn't, it's not useful for society, and they're really diminishing anything that is of any kind of, yeah, creative or kind of philosophical in any other sense. Um, I then I want to touch on, maybe as the first point for us to discuss more widely, and actually, Deborah, I was thinking you might be a person to extend this a bit further. There's been lots of reference about the role of the school community being able to engage with the wider community, and Megan talked about citizens assemblies. Eliska, that you were talking about that idea of engaging in public discussions around, you know, nuclear facility or whatever it might be locally, and decision making, and holding people to account. You've got experience in this, kind of bringing people into schools, bringing schools into kind of the outside community, and that, you know, what can we learn from mixing up people of all different parts of society?
I mean, I think it's what Eliska said about intersectionality, about cross-fertilization, about kind of like, I mean, I think collaboration is one of the keys to the unlocking what might be possible about where we're going, because as the current system's collapsing, and the emergent system is emerging, the new system is emerging, there is so less and less resourcing. So, you know, to move from scarcity to abundance, we just need to work out how to collaborate. And I think that all of these ideas, I mean, the history of my work has always been sort of in partnership with institutions, but generally outside of the institution. So literally outside the building, and thresholds are kind of, you know, psychological spaces. And so the more we can kind of mix up the kind of the you know, it's the biodiversity of the cultural soil is as depleted as the actual soil. And last week I had a little bit of an experience of working with the Multi Academy Trust, where we had six groups from six different secondary schools came together to one school, and they did this work together. And actually the richness of them sharing with each other around what they'd produced by the end of the day with the 9 artists that we had with us, like, was incredibly powerful. And I felt like that cross fertilization, which in that situation was just between the students and the staff, but I think actually when we've done work with we've done takeovers of leisure centres, which Eliska was part of one of those, so she can probably kind of like tell you about that. But like, I think there's always been this school day and then this community day, so there's a kind of opportunity for the students to come back with their families, and also, you know, with the counsellors and the kind of the key decision makers in the area, and some of the businesses who might be sponsoring it. And I think that is incredibly valuable, that as Eliska so beautifully said there, like, the kind of, you know, the young person's voice is so powerful. And when you have young people who have seen have found their agency and their kind of, and the strength of the network that can support them in that journey, they can make a huge difference to our paradigms and mindsets. So yeah, I think it's vital work. And I was also going to sort of talk about touch on what Megan was saying about the kind of the literacies, the work that she's doing with the different curriculum spaces, and Gemma, the work that you're talking about with the gamification. And that is all stuff which through this kind of action research instinctive journey that we've been on, I've got so much kind of evidence of the power of that, but also the needing to underpin the work with literacy is so vital. Because I did a kind of project where we went to 2 schools a day for 3 weeks, with assemblies and workshops with a bunch of artists, and I personally was doing some good ancestor work with the class, doing that time travel, and then on another occasion I was doing materials literacy, but with a kind of museum of the future, and without that underpinning of what is plastic, where does it come from, what is a low carbon future, like what is compost, what is the soil biome, what is the what are fossil fuels, and it's really shocking to me how, like last week, the students were all year 8 and they were coming from a geography pathway, and I mean not pathway, but subject matter, and they had such little literacy in these subjects, and their go-to theme was oceans and plastic. But I was trying to get the circular thoughts about the origins and the kind of and the rivers and all of those and acidification and all of that stuff, which, Gemma, as you say, like like you come from a dance background, I come from arts, and my literacy is so broad now, and it doesn't take much to kind of just bring it in to the conversation in 5 minutes, and the gap is in the teachers, not in the students. Sorry,
that's interesting. Sorry, because that then relates to what Megan's saying there, is how do we maybe get more of this focus on imagining the future and the skills and knowledge into teacher training, and I don't know, Megan, if you wanted to talk more about those sort of the how we might get every teacher engaged with this.
Oh, the magic question. Yeah, it's really hard, as has been observed before. And I think like with most of these things, it's a kind of multi-pronged approach. So like the UCL thing is offering kind of inspiration points effectively to teachers of saying, you can quite easily and accessibly take an online module to get some inspiration about how you could adapt your curriculum. But I think what that doesn't allow for is the other bits of this ecosystem, which are the time and space to experience some of that stuff themselves. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, Deborah. It's the literacy among students is kind of terrifyingly wobbly, but it's also probably true of many teachers that they certainly don't feel particularly confident in terms of their own literacy across those different domains. So it's a massive challenge. I mean, I was involved last week, no, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, I ran with a small team of people a 2-day workshop for teachers based at the Department for Education here in Oxford. And it was kind of amazing how much a little bit went a long way. So I think, again, chiming with what you were saying, spending a little bit of time doing nature treasure hunts, spending time doing nature connection activities, spending a bit of time just opening up kind of emotional space for them, opening up an opportunity to connect with other beings. So we were based in a museum on the first day, and off they went to find a kind of a being from the museum that they could connect to, and doing even those things for 5 or 10 minutes through quite a focused program made an enormous difference actually to their own sort of, I would say, to their own kind of emotional state, and therefore their actual ability to think more transformatively when they were then looking at sort of curriculum and pedagogy. So that was kind of a little lesson for me. I sort of hoped that was the case, but I think that was an experience that demonstrated if you just actually made a bit of space for teachers to do some of the kind of actual literacy, if you need to know what this stuff is, but also the things that we're talking about, the more imaginative, the more empathic, the more kind of emotionally held spaces for them to kind of engage, to do a little bit of kind of inner work. And actually, it doesn't take a lot of time. I think it sounds always like it will be a massive enterprise, but I actually don't think it takes a lot of time to help teachers connect to some of those things. So yeah, more CPD that is focused in a more creative way, I think, on teachers' own imaginations, doing drama, doing games. We did a little bit of that as well, actually, game-based sort of exploration as well in the conference. And teachers need those experiences as well before they are prepared to kind of engage in that kind of play. So I don't know if I've actually answered that question, Paul, but I think we need more teacher CPD, but also to think about it a little bit differently. And probably there was some great examples of that as well in the regenerative ground ed, doing stuff for teachers that carries through in their practice without having to talk about it, but give them the experiences that they will also want to give to students. And I would also throw in a word for the National Emergency Briefing as well, in terms of literacy for teachers. I think, the kind of educators version, helping teachers to be up to speed with actually where we're at is a really good starting point, and then build emotional response and build connectedness and then build the imagination on that foundation as well.
Yeah, and I guess you hope moments like the weather, the extreme weather we're experiencing, really bring that home for people. I wanted to also just open up, if anyone has any questions in the audience, either put them into the chat or raise your hand and we can come to you. And I'm hoping, Gemma, that you're wanting to come in on these elements of play, because I think something from a teacher's perspective is the role teaching can be such a serious thing and seen as very sort of professional, and the idea that you might have fun or joy or play, maybe in primary there's more elements of that, but I think that's maybe been squashed to a certain degree. But yeah, more opportunity for play, and I think that's maybe true of wider society as well. I've seen some great examples of play equipment for adults, and the idea that we might go into open spaces and public spaces and actually do things that are fun. Gemma, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to turn my video off again just in case the signal drops out. But yeah, absolutely. And I think to kind of echo again some of the things that Megan was saying there, we have spoken to a lot of teachers and kind of found that, young people are asking lots of questions about the climate and the environment and what we can do, and teachers not already always necessarily feeling equipped to answer those questions. So we run a CPD called Flipping the Climate Script, which really helps teachers to do that. But we run it just as we would run the workshop for the young people. And what I really loved when I joined Another Way was actually to see within that workshop a lot of theatre games that I have played, as someone working in the theatre, but translated into talking and making sure that we get, as Deborah says, that literacy behind it, but doing it in that very experiential learning kind of way. As someone who has previously worked in kind of theatre and dance, I'm very much a believer that actually a lot of us are kinesthetic learners. We learn through doing, and we learn through that memory of it. And that's, not always, necessarily within the education system as it stands at the moment. But I'm very much for kind of bringing that back in. That's where our kind of gamification and the play comes in. But these are also the skills that young people are going to need to go into whatever job they eventually kind of go into, that being able to creatively problem solve and figure something out rather than just recite the facts. But I think there's also something within that as well, where, as we know, the science is always changing. So there's something with the sort of I don't know if flexibility is the word that I'm looking for, but I think through the more experiential learning, through the more kind of gamification, we can take that literacy element, but in a way that kind of gets across that idea that we don't know everything yet, and we're still learning what is happening to our world right now and how we can best um, tackle that, and that we do need to be flexible and kind of move with all of that stuff. But I think it's play, it's the arts, it is that experiential learning that can bring that element. And I agree with Megan. I think teachers need to experience that for themselves first and put themselves in the position of their young people in order to then pass that on to those young people. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sort of rings true with some of that element of uncertainty there as well. So you're sort of referencing that we need to embrace that. I'm conscious of time. There is one thing which I think actually we have really referenced in a few things, but I did want to just bring up again, is that sense of the local and how important is it to connect schools and how powerful can that be with the local area? I don't know if anyone wanted to come in on the importance of the local. Megan? And then we'll come to Deborah, yeah.
I don't know if this is a, I mean, one way I was thinking about this is um, with the things that are going quite well in schools, where, for example, the National Education Nature Park and sort of creating nature spaces has got some traction. One of the ways I've been thinking about this is, creating students being engaged in creating green space at their school is a future focused imaginary
Mm.
project. And that's also where some of the kind of the cross-disciplinary stuff we talked about comes together. So students experiencing agency by being engaged in kind of garden design and green space design, a kind of hyper local power on their patch, actually seeing things happen. But first they have to kind of be imagining and conceptualizing and preparing for unexpected twists and resilience. I think a lot about like actually building sort of green space. build some of those skills that we're talking about. And there's all sorts of ways of engaging that imaginatively, and it being kind of, it has both sort of scientific and artistic dimensions. So I suppose that's one answer, which is making sure that schools doing that work and students being involved in that work can perhaps be connected up a bit more with some of the stuff that's happening in the curriculum, and thinking about how that is itself a future oriented and kind of very hopeful project, to imagine their green space and then to kind of action it as well.
Deborah.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and it all happens in the cultural soil. It doesn't happen in the big theory space, and the work is everywhere. Like the future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed, and some of the horror is not evenly distributed either. But like kind of the important thing for people in the hyperlocal is to understand that they're part of a kind of bigger, wider movement of all of these other initiatives, and to get the opportunities to understand what these other initiatives and the support and the help and the kind of the inspiration and the toolkits might be. So there's this need to be more mycelium linked is just huge. I think we just need to be able to kind of give people that kind of like those bursts of probiotic. I talk about the probiotic and the antibiotic, and the health and well-being for self, people and planet, the thought box kind of theory, which is Joanna Macy, is so important. But you only get that when you see the good stuff, when you feel the good stuff. I think if we take people's attention onto what's wrong, we're distracting them from actually using that kind of the good microbiome to kind of make themselves more healthy in their kind of practice, in their communities, and for the wider planet.
I think the theme that comes through with me there as well is that sense of the role of schools and teachers in helping to empower young people, or for them to recognize the power that they do hold within their local community and within the decision making, and that through practicing that can develop and grow, and maybe that's kind of an important role.
And who is around in the local area? What initiatives are there? There's so many like local organisations that I've been working with in around Staffordshire who are desperately trying to get to speak to people in schools, and they finding it really hard to kind of get the doors open because teachers are really busy, schools are really overwhelmed, and so like by bringing in these kind of like easier ways of connecting things up, like that's where the good work can happen.
You've reminded me again of the kind of that sense that we've built these physical fences around schools, and there's reasons for that, but that in itself has become this mental barrier where schools become very isolated places from the rest of society. And again, that's a theme that's been spoken about quite a lot throughout this.
Which is also why I love Megan's reference to the National Education and Nature Parks, because I think like doing that work with teachers in how you can teach your curriculum outdoors, is so rich and full of possibility.
Is there anything anyone wanted to also just add as sort of final thoughts? There's been some great examples in the chat. There has been a story, where is it there? Jade from the Isle of Man saying that in year 9 there is a game, the Reimagining Our Biosphere game by Ali Hodgson that she uses or is going to use in October. That is a great tool. Megan.
I guess I've just got one final thing that we didn't have much chance to talk about, but partly because you mentioned Phoebe Tickle at the beginning, but I think the idea as well, the emergence of kind of interspecies and multi-species perspectives is so interesting and exciting, happening in a lot of different fields. But it seems to me there are huge possibilities for that kind of interspecies imagination to start flourishing. And actually, this one's particularly for Gemma, but I have in mind at the moment a kind of nascent project that is about drama and interspecies assemblies, and how there's a lot of amazing sort of overlap and the potential for pedagogy that helps students start to imagine the future from different perspectives, both human and more than human. So they're kind of extending your circle of empathy. And I just really, a word really for all the other species that we might imagine with and alongside.
Megan, you would have loved. There were Annabelle and Ruth from Messages from the Wild, a podcast where they interview people who are speaking from the perspective of another species, and they kind of ask these questions. The interviews are just amazing in terms of the perspective it brings. I think, yeah, was it the MP for Nature, isn't it? This Yeah, representing different species. Sorry, did you want to speak a bit more about that, Deborah?
I'm just saying that we've done work with primary and secondary schools around the interspecies parliament, and it works really well. It's kind of that, you know, it's a really incredible thing when you sort of you embody another species and you just talk from that perspective. And I think it's, in terms of that empathy piece, it's super vital. And I think there is a kind of a methodology around building empathy, and then the literacy is easier because the kind of there's the curiosity and the critical thinking is more activated.
What I really, really appreciate is we've got to a point towards the end of this discussion where actually we're talking about the idea of flipping society completely on its head and challenging that sort of extractivist, anthropocentric approach and saying that what about if in schools we could imagine a society where, where every living thing, the human and non-human world is completely different. And I think, so many of us are talking about this as the fundamental, the way that we overcome the climate nature crisis is not with these small tweaks, but instead this big fundamental shift. Deborah, sorry.
I was just going to say, like if it's framed in a not dramatic way and in terms of something which doesn't activate the kind of like the flight or flight mechanism, like the survival skills of how do we kind of feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, house ourselves, form our communities, like they're vital skills that we have lost in our society, and we need to bring back into our world, as quickly as possible because we might well need them.
Okay, it's a good place to stop there, Deborah. Thanks. I think I was going to say thank you so much. This is not a massive amount of time, and we've managed to explore so many different themes. And thank you so much for sort of planting those seeds. And hopefully, this gives a chance for people to go and explore in their own time. And we will make sure that we add in all of the links and everything that's been spoken about. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you also to the audience that's joined us tonight and everyone who's going to watch this into the future. I did just want to mention that as it's London Climate Action Week, an interesting moment in time. Tomorrow, we're hosting a special discussion with the Rivers Trust to explore how schools could potentially be part of the solution to the water pollution crisis. So we're having that discussion tomorrow. But thank you so much, everyone, again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Great to meet you,
Thank you.
everyone.